Hey, folks! Welcome to this conversation, and thank you for being here. We have West Covina, California, just went by. New York went by. A new watcher from New York. Thanks for being here. Pittsburgh. You know how much I love Pittsburgh. Great city, historic city. Austin, Texas. Brownville, Oregon. And weeding a butterfly garden in Virginia. That's not a bad way to be spending the day. Dryden, Michigan, Sebastopol, California, Seattle, coming to say hi to your representative, I suspect. Philadelphia, waiting here on Facebook, as we always do. Jamestown, North Carolina, Fayetteville, Arkansas, Attleboro, Massachusetts, El Paso, Texas. Long history in El Paso as well. And Facebook is here. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for being here today to a conversation I'm very much looking forward to with Representative Adam Smith, who represents Washington's 9th District and has since 1997. Representative Smith is the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, which means he is the top Democrat on the committee. That's what ranking member means, is that you are the top member of the party that is not in control of the House of Representatives. He is also the founder of the Congressional Caucus for Effective Foreign Assistance. And as a representative of both of those things, I'm hoping we can talk about the relationship between the Army and foreign affairs right now. Thank you so much for being here, Representative Smith.
Well, thank you for giving me the chance. I look forward to the conversation.
So you've talked a lot about the economy right now and about how it is inaccessible to a number of Americans who previously could have had better opportunities in it. And you've talked a lot about sort of those issues. But if we can dig down today into your expertise in the armed services and in foreign affairs, I would love that. And can we start by talking about why you decided to get involved in the Armed Services Committee?
Yeah. Well, I actually decided to get involved in the Armed Services Committee because at the time I represented Fort Lewis Army Base and McChord Air Force Base. When I ran for Congress in 1996, it was against a Republican incumbent. I was part of the counter-revolution, if you remember the Gingrich Revolution back then. I had been in the state Senate for 6 years where I chaired the Judiciary Committee, so worked on a lot of those issues. I hadn't worked from a professional standpoint in foreign policy, but with those two bases in the middle of my district, they are now joint. Armed Services Committee made perfect sense. Now, they're no longer in my district. Actually, I got redistricted out about 15 years ago. But that's what sort of got me into it. And then I just have a very strong interest in that. And now I think at this point, I mean, the two sort of overlapping things that I'm trying to work on. One, I think it is imperative that we build a left of center coalition that is capable of winning elections and being able to govern. And that involves a lot of difficult issues. We're not great at building coalitions anymore. We're great at, this is what I want. How do I force everybody else to agree with me? But if you're going to build a coalition, you need to figure out, okay, what do I want? What do they want? How do we come together? I think that is sort of the missing element in our ability to push back against what I think is the grave threat of Trump and his MAGA movement. We got to build a coalition. Connected to that is we need a new approach to our foreign policy and national security policy. To be cliche, we are in the post-Cold War world. That's where we're at. That's not debatable, but what is very much up for debate, which we haven't gotten clarity on yet, is what does that mean? Okay, how do we act around China? What do we do in the Middle East? You know, how big does our military need to be? What is our foreign assistance? You know, what should it be? What is our role in a post-Cold War world? It is certainly informed by history, by basically about 110 years worth of history in terms of Americans' involvement in the world. But it is also different than that. And I think those two things are interconnected in the sense that building that Democratic coalition is primarily focused on the economic issues that you mentioned: healthcare, education, jobs, lack of equality and opportunity for too many Americans. But foreign policy and national security is part of it. Certainly, there was a major conflict within the Democratic Party in the last election over the Middle East, to some extent over Ukraine. And that hurt our ability to build that coalition that would put us in a position to win an election and govern. So that's how I see the two things sort of being interconnected, and I try to work on both.
Well, you're speaking to my heart, let me tell you. But let's walk that back a little bit. You've talked about the post-Cold War foreign policy, and what I think rather than me telling people what that is, why don't you walk us through what you think that is?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the main thing is when the Cold War ended in 1991, it was, remember, the end of history. liberal democracy had won. We never had to worry about anything anymore. Everyone was naturally moving in our direction. And that was a dangerous delusion, as we soon learned. And so I think the key components of it, and I'm flushing this out in conversations with a lot of people, but one of the biggest ones is to recognize that the US needs to stop thinking that it has to dominate the world. This was very popular in the 1990s, most notably in the New American Century, which was the definitive neocon take that basically, all right, we won the 20th century, now we have to win the 21st. We must dominate the world. And crucially, one of the ways they like to put it is we cannot allow there to be any peer competitor in the world. I mean, this is a lot of the thinking that led into Iraq, our reaction to 9/11, Afghanistan, Libya, a whole bunch of different issues that got us in trouble. So number one in the post-Cold War world is to take a step back from that. We live in a multipolar world. Now, we can get into a fascinating argument about whether or not it's better to live in a world where we're the world's sole remaining superpower. I don't think it is. And I think there's all kinds of problems that come with that people underestimate. But my opinion on that matter is irrelevant because we live in a multipolar world. We do not live in a world that the US dominates. We need to stop acting like we do. Second, we need to recognize we can't solve all the problems in the world. Now, when you look at some of our interventions globally, there are some of my friends on the left who simply put that down to the US being an evil settler colonial power that was trying to exploit people. Maybe a little bit of an element. But frankly, the other big piece of it was this notion that if there's a problem in the world, sort of forgive me, the Samantha Powers way of looking at the world, if there's a problem in the world, the US is a big, powerful nation, we got to go fix it. Whether it's in Rwanda or Somalia or Bosnia, Kosovo, Libya, wherever it is. And I think we have to be more modest in our ambitions. We cannot fix all of the problems in the world. So I think a multipolar world where we play a more modest role, and the crucial part of it, having just returned from a trip to China about a month ago now, we need to figure out some way to peacefully coexist with China. I worry a great deal about all the we must beat them, we must win. We must decouple from China. I think that's incredibly dangerous. China's not going anywhere. We're not going anywhere either, a message I delivered to China when I was over there. So we need to figure out how to stop having China and the US look at each other as a zero-sum game where one side's going to win and figure out how can we compete fairly and peacefully coexist. And then a lot of what I feel about foreign policy flows down from that. One very crucial last framework that Donald Trump is screwing up at record speed. We need partners and allies. We cannot do it all on our own, so we need partners and allies. Just to give, we saw the UK now is no longer sharing intelligence with us because of our illegal actions in the Caribbean, blowing up drug boats. The Quad, the latest meeting of this is the Australia, Japan, India, US, we're building a partnership and an alliance. It got canceled because Modi is understandably a bit bent out of shape about the 50% tariffs that Trump arbitrarily slapped on them. So partners and allies, that's the basic frame. Can't dominate the world, can't save all the world's problems. We need partners and allies going forward. And lastly, I do believe that we, as one of the powerful countries in the world, do need to be engaged in the world, but we need to figure out how to do it in a more positive way. That's the post-Cold world as I see it.
Okay, I want to walk back just a little bit because you throw out some terms that people may not be familiar with, and that is the post-World War II world was one in which the former allies of World War II had worked together to create a rules-based international order. The idea that rather than going to war, people had fora in which they could work out their differences. And with the rise of the Soviet Union, there was a period that we know as the Cold War in which the two superpowers, the US and the USSR, faced off against each other. And with the collapse of that in 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a sense among Americans and people who were allied with us, perhaps, that, as you said, there's an end of history. The whole world was going to get this, that's right, this democratic idea behind it. But I'm going to insert something that you might push back on. There is a way of thinking about that period in the 90s that suggests that people who become the neocons, the neoconservatives, who come up with this idea of the American century, right? This idea that there's going to be this whole
the new American century.
The new American century. That's right. That the fall of the Soviet Union means that democracy and capitalism will spread around the world because they travel together. And so what they really focused on was the spread of capitalism into the former Soviet republics, for example. But what we have learned since then is that democracy and capitalism can be decoupled. And this is one of the reasons we're in such Mel of a Hess, as my mother would have said. But if you think then about the post-Cold War period, and this is what I really want you to push forward on, is under President Joe Biden and his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, they said the same thing. The post-Cold War period is gone. It is not coming back. So how do we spread democracy and the kind of values that support strong economies and strong allyships around the world without imposing our military will on other countries? And they came up with a system that had a terrible name. They called it diplomatic variable geometry, which to my mind was just ad hoc committees.
The Biden administration had many positives, many negatives. They were some of the worst communicators I've ever worked with in my political life.
Really, honestly, every time I want to talk about diplomatic variable geometry, I have to look it up again. And I'm always like, I know there's some kind of math involved. But what they simply were doing was creating what I considered ad hoc committees. That is, they would say, we have a real problem in a number of places in the world with the issue of fentanyl. So we're going to get everybody who's part of the fentanyl issue around the table to talk about getting rid of the precursor chemicals that come from China, getting rid of the financing that builds the factories in Mexico, doing this sort of at the macro level. That idea of creating ad hoc committees to do things like manage development in Africa, to manage the Middle East, to manage immigration around this hemisphere, in many ways actually worked.
Yeah, no, it worked in Asia quite well. As we built partnerships, I mentioned the Quad, but also the AUKUS agreement, strengthening relationships with Japan, the Philippines, South Korea. Yeah, but I think there was a couple of flaws in that. And that gets to the second point I made earlier. And that is just this presumption that our mission is to spread democracy. And flaw number one in that is—
that was my words, by the way, not theirs, because they made it a point of saying we're not trying to spread democracy. We're just trying to fix individual problems. Go ahead.
Their rhetoric didn't always match that, but yes. So that democracy is not an on-off switch. First of all, governance is a complicated thing. And I think what we need to be promoting more is greater opportunity, basically greater freedom, prosperity, and peace. And doing that with an understanding of sort of what we don't know. It's not going to work the same in Africa. And I think this gets into the small ad hoc thing. It's not going to work the same way in Africa that it does in Asia, that it does in Europe. So be a little bit flexible how we approach it. I will agree with that. I would say that instead of whatever that geometry thing means. But yes.
The other correction that I would make there is I always wonder, are we trying to achieve peace, or are we trying to achieve not fighting, which are not necessarily the same things. But now you are articulating in the House and in the many speeches you've been giving a real criticism of what the Trump administration is now doing. And I wonder if you can walk us through that, because it's an utter rejection, I think, of those ad hoc committees and that version of a post-Cold War diplomacy or a post-Cold War foreign affairs. And it's replacing it with something that looks very much like 19th century imperialism.
Absolutely. Yeah. So first of all, I would be more of a let's not fight as opposed to, holding out for perfect peace, which isn't to say that you don't work on longer term solutions. But I think a lot of times, look, that was the philosophy behind the Iraq War. Okay. George W. Bush was sick of playing whack-a-mole. We're going to go in, we're going to fix this once and for all. We're going to make this big, bold step. We're going to put a democracy in the middle. yeah, let's be a little more modest in our ambitions. Stopping the fighting, even if you don't have a perfect plan for peace, is a huge positive. So I would be on that. In terms of what Trump is doing, look, you have to understand that most of what Trump does is about his personal power. Sometimes when I'm really fired up, I will say that Trump doesn't have a policy thought in his head. It's all about whatever is going to assuage his ego from one moment to the next. That's a slight overstatement. He allows himself to at least be influenced by people who have policy objectives. Stephen Miller, who hates immigrants and wants to make America white again. The Peter Navarro.
You've spoken very positively of his appointment of Purdue to China.
Yeah, I mean, a broken clock is right twice a day. As I said, private conversation. I won't tell you who I said it to. I said, it's amazing. Every once in a while, Trump accidentally picks someone who's qualified for the job he gave them. So that does happen. But the larger point is, Trump sees the world in terms of power. He wants as much power as possible, and he's going to try to exercise it in the most aggressive way he can. That's why he likes the tariffs. Sorry. I'm going to clear my throat there. The tariffs give him the ability. If he doesn't like the way Brazil's treating Bolsonaro, 50% tariff. He doesn't like that Modi didn't give him credit for something he didn't deserve credit for, stopping the fight between India and Pakistan earlier this year, 50% tariff. And then they have to come to Trump. It's all about Trump passing out these tariffs. You want to negotiate with him. It consolidates power in his hands, but it's very disruptive in terms of building the type of partnerships and relationships that we need to be successful. And to your larger point about imperialism, let's not forget, Trump was running around talking about invading Panama, annexing Canada, taking Greenland. No, I think he has a viewpoint of he wants to expand the territory that the U.S. controls, which is an interesting contradiction with this essential America first isolation thing, which I think is making Marjorie Taylor Greene's head explode as we speak, and trying to figure out how to square that. But yeah, it's the worst of all possible worlds in terms of Trump's foreign policy. He's alienating all of our partners and allies, alienating as many countries as he possibly can, while getting us more deeply involved in conflicts. Now he's talking about Nigeria. So yes, you described Trump perfectly. 19th century imperialism is his mindset, and we don't live in that world anymore.
Okay, so I think that's right, and there's, you could go through the difference between the way he is managing issues in what seemed to be what he is trying to develop as a United States sphere versus what he's doing around the world. But I'm actually really interested, hugely interested, in a vision of American foreign policy going forward. Because, one of the things that I sit and think about is there are so many patterns that have been laid down over the last 150 years in the way that Americans tend to perceive the different parties in foreign policy, which are often not at all aligned with what actually happened. But if you're a Republican right now and you were an America firster, or you were somebody who believed in spreading democracy, or, you could take any of those positions, he has simply blown all those up. They're gone. I don't know. Like, I often lay in bed and pretend I'm a Republican speechwriter. And I think, on foreign policy, what on earth do you put in that? So that seems to me exactly what you have identified. The Democrats now have a wonderful opportunity to articulate a new way going forward. And your issues with Biden's foreign policy were somewhat different than mine, but it really hadn't fully digested a post-Cold War period. Yeah. How do you see foreign policy going forward from a Democratic perspective, and with luck from an American perspective?
Yeah, frankly, my biggest issue with Biden's foreign policy was his inability to articulate it. Whether it was on Ukraine or otherwise, he was all over the map in terms of communication strategy. That's part of the challenge of having a president in the United States who wasn't capable of communicating clearly. You can send Jake Sullivan out wherever, and okay, he's a pretty smart guy, but he's not the president. So his inability to articulate what he was trying to accomplish exactly in Ukraine and elsewhere, I think, undermined it. But in terms of the Democratic foreign policy, I would say what I said at the outset. Don't dominate, don't try to solve all the world's problems, work cooperatively towards a more fair, rules-based international order that promotes greater peace and stability, and be humble about it. I think humility is one of the central parts of this. When we run around saying we have a rules-based international order, it's not hard for people to point out to, well, you didn't follow the rule. Okay. Rules are not perfect. They are not followed perfectly, and we shouldn't pretend that they are. We should try to present ourselves as wanting to work cooperatively with the rest of the world, not as the country that has the one perfect solution to how the world should be run, and then react accordingly and build greater partnerships. And to the development point, we also need to get more friends. It's great that we've got the partnerships and alliances that we do, but we're sort of losing out on the emerging powers right now. I mentioned Brazil and India, but South Africa, Nigeria is another emerging power that we just threatened to invade. So we're losing out in the developing world. And I think, cutting off USAID certainly didn't help. We basically promised food to people and then took it away so that people literally starved to death. So we need to better engage with sort of what you can refer to as the undecided vote. When we're trying to figure out how do we shape the world more in the direction that we want to take it than the direction that China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and various terrorist groups want to take it, we're going to need friends. We're going to need partners. And Trump is busily alienating every single last one of them with that 19th century imperialistic sort of way of looking at things.
Well, I think it's absolutely right on all counts. But here is an issue with that concept of simply having friends and ad hoc committees to figure things out, which I think is the model that the Biden administration used in all of its issues. And
Yes.
that is, there is not, to my mind, in that argument, the intellectual underpinning of that argument, a solution for what one does when one of the people in that ad hoc committee is somebody like Donald Trump, or somebody who simply wants their own power and says, I don't care what's good for this group. I'm going to do what's good for me to stay out of jail, for example. And if that means bombing the crap out of the next country, I'm going to do it. And that seems to me to be something that we need to grapple with going forward. And, to me, I look at it and I think, well, maybe one of the answers is economic sanctions, but that's really slow and a lot of people die while that's happening. Do you have any sense of is there an answer to that, or is just this part of the messiness of dealing with other countries?
No, I think the answer to that is humility. And it's something that we fail to have. We overpromise and underdeliver, which is no way to build a relationship. And I get it. And I think part of this, and what I hope people will understand is the history does matter here. I was speaking with one of my colleagues yesterday about this very subject. And he was saying, well, gosh, no one remembers anything that happened before 2001 for the most part now. Okay, but then that's part of our obligation to educate them about it. Why does the U.S. look at the world the way we look at it? And essentially, prior to the two world wars, our attitude was the rest of the world is a bit of a pain in the butt. We shouldn't be involved. All right. The lesson that we took, rightly or wrongly, from World War I and World War II was no. We have to get to, the way I like to put it, this never goes over that well, but I'm going to keep trying. We have to get to the left of bang. Okay. We want to try to shape events so that we don't stumble into these world wars and global conflicts. And, we had frankly, a fairly unprecedented amount of success at doing that. We defeated Hitler. We defeated Japan. We rebuilt both quite effectively. Ultimately, we defeated the Soviet Union. But that sort of gave us this greater idea. This is a tiny little anecdote here, but Thomas Friedman's first book, From Beirut to Jerusalem, he talked about how Lebanon was falling apart. And then word came that Reagan had decided to send in the Marines, that America was coming. And in Lebanon, everyone's like, thank God, this is going to fix everything. People don't appreciate the degree to which the rest of the world had that perception of us, even after Vietnam, okay? Because we won World War II, all right? We beat Hitler, we beat Japan, and we were this big, powerful country. And so people came to rely on us as the country that was going to solve problems, and for your more left-leaning folks listening to this who are screaming at the screen, I do understand that at times we did not necessarily have other countries or the rest of the world's best interests at heart in the way that we engaged. But nonetheless, there was this perception of the omnipotence of America. And personal story, I was in Jordan in 2013, and I met with some Syrian refugees, and they found out they were meeting with a member of the U.S. Congress, and they were pissed. And their basic point was, I'm forgetting Bashar Assad. I want to say Sadat. I knew that wasn't right. Bashar Assad wouldn't be doing what he was doing in Syria if the U.S. didn't want it to be done, because that's just how powerful you are. You could fix this if you wanted to. So the fact that you're not means that you don't. And I was like, nah, no, we don't have that type of capability. So humility is the answer to that. And I think blaming us for the fact that Ukraine hasn't been able to defeat Russia, for the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine, frankly, for all the conflict in the Middle East. And certainly there are ways that we could handle that better. I think a president needs to say, we're going to do what we can, but let's not create an expectation that we cannot meet. I have Europeans who are angry as hell about the fact that we pulled out of Afghanistan. And I've gotten into some really full-on arguments with it. Well, how could we possibly trust you? I'm like, yeah. We spent 20 years, several $1 trillion, thousands of lives, tens of thousands injured, trying to fix a problem that couldn't be fixed. You name me any other partner in the history of the frickin' world that would have put that much effort into it. And at the end of the day, we couldn't solve it. And we couldn't solve it because it couldn't be solved. All right. And we should have figured that out about 10 years before we did. But now they're angry because we didn't fix Afghanistan. So I think we need to take those expectations down to start with. That is the key part. We'll work with you. We're trying to get there. Let's stop walking in and say the U.S. is here. Everybody's going to be fine. It's a lot harder than that.
Well, in terms of trying to work with people and to run up against a leader who refuses to do what is best for usually his people, I mean, that's an interesting approach. I do wonder, because it's rather like people trying to deal with the U.S. now and having to deal with Trump.
Exactly.
Maybe there is no way for there to be a way to handle a rogue leader. But if you have one, I think we have to have a better answer than we're just going to have to deal with a rogue leader and hope that the people in that country eventually deal with them. Because you look at somebody like al-Assad and think, he did a hell of a lot of damage for a really long time.
Yeah, absolutely. But that presumes that there is a better answer. And frankly, I think this is one of the problems that we have in public policy in the U.S. right now. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of frustration. Pick an issue on foreign policy, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration. People are angry. Yeah. What happened in Syria? What's happened in Sudan right now? What happened in Gaza? What's happening in Gaza? There's a lot of anger and frustration about that. Domestically, there's a lot of anger about the fact that healthcare is so expensive. There's a lot of anger about the fact that there isn't more opportunity. I do think we have to let people know that civil society is hard. You got a whole lot of people competing here. How do we get to the right answer? And what we've discovered, what our politicians have discovered, none better than Donald Trump, by the way, is if you simply not just tap into that anger, but actually throw fuel on the fire of it and try to make it more, that people will, for at least a time, turn to you. That's not helpful. Somebody needs to come along and say, look, everyone's upset about, our budget situation. The American people want us to balance the budget without raising taxes or cutting spending. That's a problem. All right. And it's not a problem because our system is corrupt or our system is incompetent or the rich have too much power. It's a problem because the frickin' math doesn't add up. And too many politicians have come around and tried to claim that it did and tried to promise this to you. Healthcare. There's a finite amount of resources available to provide healthcare. The demand for healthcare significantly outstrips the supply to provide the goods and services that people want. How do you manage that? I love it when people were critical of the ACA. You want to ration healthcare. We can't every healthcare system ever invented has rationed healthcare because there's not enough of it to go along. The question is, are you doing it fairly or not? In the US, we're not doing it fairly. Let's work on that instead of setting up this impossible objective. So I hear you. And whenever anyone raises a question like you just said, I'm like, I am willing to learn. All right. I'm wrong all the time. You got something? Let me know what it is. But don't give me there just has to be a better answer.
Well,
Sure.
so when you articulate a democratic foreign policy going forward after what I and I suspect you would characterize as the debacle of an attempt to return to 19th century imperialism,
Amen.
give me you had three pillars. Give those to me again.
Yeah. Three pillars basically one, don't try to dominate. Don't try to solve all the world's problems. Build partnerships and alliances as aggressively as you can. And I guess the fourth one would be don't fully retreat from the world. We need to be engaged. And then I guess the overarching, and remember the overarching goal, greater peace, greater prosperity. And to do that, you need to build a system of a rules-based international order that isn't going to be perfect, but it's better than chaos. And let's always keep working to make it better. And that gets into the partners and alliances. You want to bring in those partners. You want to include them because that's what part of what's going to get more people to buy into the system.
Crowdsourcing, in effect.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, I have two more quick questions for you. And one is going to be a surprise to you, I suspect, because I suspect it doesn't come up much in conversations, but maybe I'm wrong. Who are, and I won't say the one, but who are the people in the past in foreign affairs or the military that you look to as either models or as inspirations?
Yeah, I don't think anyone is a particular model. I think we've got a lot of people who are very knowledgeable and trying to do the right thing in the right way. And I will answer your question in a moment. But I think that's one of the things that a lot of people are saying is anyone who's been involved in any decision that's been made in the last 30 years is dumb, stupid, and should be pushed to the side. I don't agree with that. Things haven't worked out perfectly, to be sure. There are some that I'm more fond of than others, but that knowledge base matters. And also, again, you're sort of presuming that there was some easy answer that they just didn't seize upon. There's all very difficult problems, but I think Jake Sullivan's a very smart, capable guy who's got a ton of experience. He's better now than he was when he showed up as the National Security Advisor because he's been through it. He didn't necessarily handle everything perfectly, but he's learned a lot, and that knowledge base helps him. Michelle Flournoy, very, very smart person. She was Undersecretary for Policy. Colin Kahl, who had the Undersecretary for Policy job as well. Colin was the guy who actually consistently, clearly articulated our policy in Ukraine in a way that virtually nobody else in the Biden administration seemed capable of doing. Mark Milley, I thought, was an outstanding chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who had a big sort of broad knowledge of the world. And I liked working with him as well. So I don't think there's any one person who's necessarily done it absolutely right, but I think we have a lot of knowledgeable, well-informed people that can really contribute to positive policy going forward.
Oh, I was looking for an Eisenhower or a, Marshall or something like that.
I tend to not want to go back to the Cold War people because after we won World War II, they had it a lot easier than the modern people did. We had a level of power in a fairly clear world, to deal with at that point that and I'm not saying they didn't make good decisions. They did. Certainly, George Marshall and all that, they did. But I think it underestimates the complexity of what we're dealing with now.
That's fair. That's fair. So my last question for you is one I always like to ask people, and that is, what would you tell everyday Americans or ordinary Americans to do in this moment, either to support the military or to think about or even affect foreign policy in a new century?
Yeah. The first thing I would tell them is you don't necessarily have to. I think there's a tendency, I have to. Look, it's a nation of 350 million people. We don't need 350 million people trying to set our foreign policy. And it's fine. You got other things you're working on. That's perfectly okay. If you want to get involved and get engaged, I would say there are a lot of different organizations out there that I think are very thoughtful about this. Join them, learn from them, and contribute to them. I know more on the development assistance side. There's a group called Results that organizes and lobbies for effective foreign aid, and they're everywhere. They work in different constituencies. Join a group that you think has generally good principles, and work with them on that. There's the Truman Foundation is a group on the Democratic side that's trying to come up with a foreign policy that's somewhat along the lines of what I'm talking about. They're a good group of people. Engage there and learn, and also be willing to listen as well as speak. And this is, going back all the way full circle to where I started in terms of how do we build an effective coalition. The Democratic Party right now has about 20 million people who are all convinced that they know exactly what we ought to do. And if we don't do exactly what they think we ought to do, then that proves we're stupid and we're going to lose. Be a little bit more inclusive about that. You got some good ideas to contribute? Great. But listen to the other people around you too. View it as you're trying to build a coalition, not as, okay, I know what has to be done. How do I force all of these morons to do it? It's a subtle little difference in terms of how you choose to engage in public policy, but it makes a huge difference if you want to have a functioning democracy and have a coalition that can win. You got to work to have a coalition that can win. You're going to have to work with some people who don't see things exactly the same way you do. So approach it with that sense of openness.
And I will add, it's not a bad idea to follow some of the organizations that are working on the sort of the intellectual side of foreign affairs, and the military as well. The State Department used to do all kinds of interviews, which it doesn't any longer, but there are plenty of people who are actively engaged in the conversations about the world, who are, have seminars and stuff online all the time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here, Representative. It's been really interesting. Best of luck to you. And I hope we could do this again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for what you do. A lot of people heard that I was going to be on your show and they're like, oh, I love her. So you're reaching people in a positive way. And I appreciate that.
Well, we're all doing it together, but let's really push that foreign affairs stuff because I think we don't talk about it enough.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.